In today's video, I wanted to continue with and finish up my journey through the Elder Scrolls Arena's main questline. Last time, I retrieved 3 pieces of the Staff of Chaos, making a total of 6 in my inventory. I located the 4th piece at the Halls of Colossus in the province of Elsewhere. For the 5th, I found it at the Crystal Tower in the province of Somerset Isle. Then lastly, the 6th piece was located at the Crypt of Hearts in High Rock. In order to get each staff fragment, I had to fetch an artifact for one of the local factions of each province. After collecting the 6th staff piece, Rhea Silmain informed me that the next destination, Murkwood, was either in Blackmarsh or Morrowind. This is where the story continues. Running back into town, I cornered the first NPC I saw and asked about Murkwood. They confirmed my suspicion and said to check out the swampy province of Blackmarsh. Traveling to Blackrose, I continued my search until finally, someone told me to look into the city of Stormhold. The locals there mentioned that a faction known as the Conclave of Baal might know the dungeon's location. However, the NPC thinks it'll be hard to pry it out of them. Already knowing how these things go, I located the Conclave and spoke with its leader, Eidolon Lancaster. Lancaster informed me of the faction's recent mishap. One of their initiates cast a powerful spell in an attempt to impress the higher-ups. The spell was uncontrollable, and the best the elders could do to dissipate it was by sending it straight down into the earth. This ended up collapsing the surrounding area, which at the time were the vaults of Gemin. Many artifacts were lost, including a tablet that's needed to locate Murkwood. Lancaster asks me to retrieve said tablet in exchange for information on the dungeon. The Vaults of Gemin is your classic 2-level dungeon. The first area is rather large, and there are a lot of little rooms and chambers that you can easily wander into. I started in the central northern part of the map and had to work my way down to the zone center. Luckily, most of the travel time is spent wandering down one long hallway. Once I reached the edge of the corridor, I just had to cross through a few rooms before hitting the entrance to level 2. You'll see it as the dungeons go on, but I was starting to have a really tough time facing off against casters. Homunculi, hellhounds, and wraiths in particular were giving me some serious problems. They were almost always in groups of 2 and just spaced out enough to where my attacks wouldn't be able to land on both of them. I got pretty bold after completing the last few dungeons with very few deaths. So much so that I had got into the habit of saving less frequently. Well, during this particular adventure, it was safe to say that I had my confidence squashed back down. In terms of lore for the Vaults of Gemin, there really aren't any messages or notes left around from the game. What's more, almost all of the dungeons in Arena can be discovered and explored in future installments of the series. They're pretty much all accessible in ESO. However, the vaults are completely absent from every other title. So really, they were created with Arena and also taken down with it. The second level of the vaults was a real pain in the neck. It was a large flooded chamber with several decently sized islands connected to one another. Scattered around the outskirts of those islands on their own little perches were stone golems. They were excellent shots and could knock my health down in no time. Again, it seemed like most of the enemies here were spellcasters, including more wraiths and homunculi. They definitely did a good number on my character. After hacking and slashing my way through, I finally made it to the magically sealed door. It presented me with a riddle, which read, "I come out of the earth, I am sold in the market. He who buys me cuts off my tail, takes off my suit of silk, and weeps beside me when I am dead." This one actually came to me pretty quickly, as the tail and weeping part gave it away. The answer was onion. Inside of the small chamber were 2 more wraiths, a small pile of treasure, and of course, the tablet. Securing it and making my escape from the Vaults of Gemin, I traveled back to Stormhold. Presenting the tablet to Eidolon Lancaster, he remarks at how the vaults have fallen to dark forces, but in any case, he's content with the artifact's retrieval. Using the tablet, he's able to show me the exact location of Murkwood. Wasting no time, I traveled on over and was met with its title card. It read, "The mists of Murkwood, the black forests swirl about. Inside the dark forests can be heard faint cries of despair, souls who have lost their way within its cunning web. Though the smell of decay flows from every tree and stone, within this forest lies the 7th piece of the Staff of Chaos." The crawl through Murkwood was officially my fastest time in and out of any given dungeon. I was able to secure the staff fragment in under 20 minutes, which for me was unheard of. Murkwood is a 2-level dungeon, which at this point in the game feels quite strange to see. The first zone is rather unique. Similar to the Elden Grove, it takes place outside. The catch though is that the area is massive and most of it is open and barren, meaning that without a third-party map, I'm betting it's really easy to get lost in here. The center is where you can find the doorway to the second level. That little central section though is a mess of tight walkways. It creates a somewhat intricate maze that the player needs to navigate through. In terms of enemies, really there weren't that many here, at least compared to other dungeons. Periodically there were fire demons, wraiths, or wolves, but they weren't very frequent. However, I did formally get introduced to the Medusa. They're certainly one of the more powerful foes in the game. Two of them were bunched up, and together they created what felt like an unstoppable force. One would paralyze me while the other would lunge in for the attack. However, the difference between their paralysis and, let's say, a spider's is that the Medusas never went away. At least I never survived long enough to see it go away on its own. Potions of free action were a necessity for facing off against them, and even so, nothing was stopping the Medusae from letting off another spell right after. They certainly gave me some trouble, but eventually I was able to best them and head for the nearby locked gate. I needed to correctly answer this riddle in order to get past it. I tie and hold, capture and bind, yet both knights and knaves doth crave me. I faithfully enslave all within my grasp, whether or not they seek me. Yet those who have never felt my unmerciful hand are pitied by their fellow man. Initially, I was thinking of a sheath. I thought of a sword being bound, held, and stayed by a knight. As it would turn out though, the answer is love. The second level of Murkwood was honestly way too easy, but considering I was getting dungeon fatigue, there were no complaints from me. It was a small chamber that held several locked cells. Behind each one of them was an iron golem. At the back of the room was a singular locked door. Approaching it, the game presented me with yet another riddle. I run smoother than any rhyme, I love to fall but cannot climb. I tremble at each breath of air, and yet can heaviest burdens bear. It's safe to say that I'm not nailing too many of these riddles, as my first guess was singing or song. The answer for this one though was water. If I had typed in the wrong answer, then an iron golem would be released from one of the cells. At the back of the previously locked chamber was the seventh piece of the Staff of Chaos. Snagging it, I successfully fled Murkwood and made my way back to Stormhold. Resting in the wilderness, I triggered my vision from Jagar Tharn.
You amaze me with your tenacity. This game, however, is at an end, as you may already know.
The final piece of the staff is in Degothur, in the province of Morrowind. The information is useless to you, for none know the entrance to the volcano. And even if you survive the creatures I have sent against you now, you will not survive its depths. I bid you farewell. You have been a most worthy opponent.
Tharn really isn't sending his best after me, as all I encountered here was a lone rogue. Once ready, I rested again and received my last vision from Rhea Silmain.
I would take no chances, for Tharn has no mercy and will attack the moment he perceives the staff reassembled. You must be swift. To the northeast lies the Fire Mountain, Degothur. Somewhere in its volcanic depths is the final piece of the Staff of Chaos. The entrance to that fabled mountain has disappeared with the dwarves that mined it. There may still be those who know of it, however. Find the entrance, enter the volcanic catacombs, and return with the final piece of the staff. We are so close. I wish you well.
From my time playing through Morrowind, I more or less knew where the entrance to Degothur was. However, I of course had to go through the motions with Arena. Traveling to the island of Vardenfell, more specifically to the town of Stoneforest, I asked around for more information. The first NPC I spoke with said to check in at the city of Ebonheart. In doing so, someone told me that the palace might have records of Degothur and its entrance. Stumbling into the court and speaking with King Kasich, he offered me a deal. Apparently, there's a fabled hammer called the Hammer of Garen. When combined with the Anvil of Mythos, a blacksmith has the ability to create some of the finest weapons and armor in all of the land. What's more, the ringing of the hammer on the anvil is what reveals the location of Degothur. By recovering the hammer from a place called Blackgate, I'll be able to gain some knowledge on the final dungeon. Continuing the trend, Blackgate is a bi-level dungeon, and of course, those two levels are massive in size. However, the navigation through this dungeon is actually pretty straightforward. I started off in the northeastern corner and worked my way over to the center. After traveling south from the start and crossing through a few rooms, I ended up in a channel of water. That channel was able to take me all the way to the middle of the zone, and what's more, I didn't encounter a single enemy on the swim over. However, after making landfall, the wraiths and the homunculi were extra destructive. I guess they were making up for the lack of action in the waterways. After stumbling on into the second zone, I was immediately met with a magically sealed door. Of course, I was long overdue for a riddle. This one went, "What is the thing which comes in sheets yet cannot be folded or gathered again?" Honestly, I really wasn't sure. For fun, I wanted to go with metal, even though I knew it was wrong. The correct answer here was rain, which, thinking on it, I had heard of rainfall being referred to as sheets maybe once or twice before. Ultimately though, I wasn't getting that one right. Zone 2 for Blackgate is actually pretty interesting. The hammer is located in the southwestern section of the level. I popped out just north of it. However, in order to gain access to the room it's in, I need to secure one of 3 keys. There are ruby, emerald, and sapphire keys scattered throughout the dungeon. The former 2 are pretty far from the hammer and require some extensive navigation. However, if you're lucky, the sapphire key can spawn in right by the sealed doorway. According to the wiki, there's an iron golem stationed by the room that drops the key when it dies. However, it's a pretty common bug for the key to simply not drop, and the price of that is more time spent in this dungeon trying to find the other 2 keys. Certainly not the end of the world, but it's nice having that option of convenience. After defeating the Iron Guardian, I must have had a 4-leaf clover in my pocket, as Robocop Reincarnate dropped the key. Gaining access to the room, I was met with another Iron Golem, as well as a Fire Demon. Blackgate was throwing its best at me, but I've been able to hold my ground thus far. After successfully obtaining the Hammer of Gemin, I hightailed it out of the dungeon. At this point, given the enemies that I'm facing and their abilities, it's almost just as tricky to leave these places as it is to enter them. I used to be able to run right out of each zone, but now there are casters placed everywhere just waiting for me to turn the corner. Returning to Ebonheart and giving the legendary hammer to King Kasich, he was ecstatic and immediately began using it. Hitting the anvil, he learned where the entrance to Degothur was and inscribed it on my map. At this point, I was excited yet nervous. The final piece of the Staff of Chaos was right there, but I knew that this was going to be some of the finest dungeon crawling that Arena had to offer. And boy was I right. Stocking up on regular potions, potions of heal true, potions of free action and cure disease, I readied myself and made way for Degothur. Arriving, I was met with its title card. The sacred entrance of the Dwarven Smiths into the Fire Mountain, Degothur stands before you. Magical runes glow in the red firelight, shimmering with heat. Sulphurous gouts of steam escape from vents within the rock face of the opening. The final piece of the Staff of Chaos beckons. Degothur brings things back to a tri-level dungeon. The first level is fairly straightforward. I spawned in at the northeastern corner of the map and had to travel to the central western part. The crawl took me on a direct path that literally had me zigging west and zagging south. Probably less than a third of the map was actually necessary to go through. Although, I will say, the ease of navigation was offset by the difficulty of the enemies. What's more, the first zone wasn't even the worst of it, as level 2 had some of the toughest enemies found in the game. This area employed the same gimmick as the Halls of Colossus. Right by the entrance, there are 5 locked doors. Each door is opened by a different key. Those keys are placed all around the level. There's one in the center and one in every corner of the map. If you have Passwall or the Skeleton Key, this zone is over in less than 20 seconds, and Degothur might be one of the easiest dungeons for you to crawl through. Otherwise, if you're a regular old warrior like myself, it's time to run the gauntlet. The first key I went for was the ruby one up in the northwestern corner. This was one of the simpler fights, as all that was guarding it was an iron golem. Honestly, the most difficult part was platforming over to the island. Platforming, jumping around, leaping for my life, those were never really mechanics in the game up until now, and Zone 3 brings them to a whole new level. Without jumping ahead though, it was on to the diamond key, which was in the central chamber. Technically, this was the most difficult key to obtain, as its guardian was a lich. I had never faced one before and wasn't sure what to expect. Apart from their creepy look and their horrific sound, the fight wasn't too bad. It took me a really long time to vanquish it, and I did go through more than a few health potions, but at least it couldn't paralyze me. Not to mention, a lot of its hits were not landing. Maybe that part was a fluke, but I've learned to take the small victories wherever I could. The next key had me venturing up to the northeastern corner of the map. Compared to the last one, this fight was like a breath of fresh air. A simple hop over the lava stream and a tussle with a fire demon. Nothing too difficult, and the sapphire key was a quick grab. With only 2 left, I wandered down to the southeastern corner and faced off against the second most powerful, non-unique enemy in the game, a vampire. I was surprised with how tall this thing was. The NPCs in the game are gigantic to begin with, but this undead night owl could have played in Tamriel's NBA. While the fight was still challenging, and it also made some unsettling noises, I was able to destroy the vampire quicker than I had destroyed the Lich. It did slightly less damage to me than the glorified necromancer had done. However, I ended up catching some sort of disease from it, which normally wouldn't have been an issue, but this time I was completely out of cure disease potions. I distinctly remember carrying at least one when entering the dungeon, but I must have misclicked and used it up. In any case, once I secured the amethyst key, it was onto the southwestern corner of the level. The crystal key was being guarded by a Medusa. The Medusa was camping an island surrounded by lava. All things considered, it's not the trickiest enemy to deal with, but that ranged paralysis attack can be a real nightmare. Running straight at it down a narrow walkway is probably the worst tactic, but it's all I could do here. Eventually though, after a lot of trial and error, I made it onto the island, bested the serpent lady, and recovered the final key. Unlocking the 5 doors, I booked it into the final zone. As mentioned before, level 3 really utilized platforming, something that hasn't really been a thing up until Degothur. The main chamber was flooded with lava. Scattered around the area were small islands. These were what the player needed to use in order to make it to the central structure. Accurately judging those long jumps wasn't easy to begin with. Combine those with the spellcasters and ranged enemies that were stationed all around, this could have possibly been one of the trickiest areas in the entire game. I cursed my Nord's warrior bones, thinking if only I had some sort of levitation spell. However, that's when I remembered, a long time ago, I had picked up a potion of levitate. It was just sitting there in my inventory waiting for a rainy day. Popping it, I was able to fly right on over to the middle of the zone, no problems at all. In that moment, it was truly a game changer. Although, I had some other issues that I was dealing with. I had just run out of potions of Heal True, and I only had about 40 or so regular health pots left. Backtracking through 3 zones with under 50 was scary business for me, but it would have to do. Leaping into the center of the structure, I landed on the 8th and final piece of the Staff of Chaos. Getting near it, I was presented with this level's only riddle. It went from the beginning of eternity to the end of time and space, to the beginning of ever end and the end of every place. What am I? I assumed the answer was going to be something deep, like life or death. It actually ended up just being the letter E. This lowered the surrounding walls, allowing for me to escape the box. Grabbing a hold of the 8th piece, the staff reconnected and power surged through my character's body. The game displayed a message saying I was worthy, to go in peace, and to have my fate written in the elderscrolls. All that was left now was to leave Degothur. Since I was low on potions, I really tried to take advantage of resting for a full health bar. In doing so, I triggered another vision from Jagar.
I congratulate you on your success. Have you discovered, however, what I have known all along? The staff is drained of all magical potential. I did it myself before scattering the pieces across the realm. It is a useless stick, good for churning butter or rowing a boat, but not for saving the Emperor. Come find me if you dare, and I will relieve you of any further burdens you may think to face. My legions await.
I mentioned it before, but Rhea Silmane's prior visit was her last. We unfortunately don't get to see her again in the game. It didn't feel like a proper goodbye or send-off either. There wasn't a lot of closure, but I suppose her ghost speaking to the player was closure enough. There's one final dungeon to deal with, and then that's a wrap on Arena. I didn't get a chance to talk about Degothur's lore yet. If you played Morrowind, you know exactly how important this stretch of Red Mountain really is. It's endgame territory for the Nerevarine. However, in Arena, the messages really only relay how hot, ashy, and fiery the volcano is. Prior to that, we learned how this was a central smithing area to the dwarves. But nothing is shared on its importance to the Chimer, the Dunmer, the Sixth House, House Endoril, etc. While the lore was simply not fleshed out at the time, it does make some sense as to why the player wouldn't have heard anything about it. The Sixth House was rather secretive and dormant up until the events of Morrowind. The Dunmer don't exactly like Outlanders meddling in their affairs, and probably wouldn't have openly shared said information. Plus, during Arena, the main quest has you put your head down and move full steam ahead through the dungeons. Given the 38-year difference between the start of each game, it's pretty interesting to think that somewhere in a separate chamber of Degothur, Degothur himself is preparing for total domination. Successfully leaving the dungeon with my diseased body and lack of health potions, I practically kissed the ground of Ebonheart. It was now time to gear up for one final ride, the assault on Jagartharn. I had pretty much blown through most of my gold on provisions for Degothur, so I was pretty worried that I wouldn't be able to afford any more potions. However, I got lucky in that I was able to recover quite a few bracelets, amulets, and marks from the dungeon. Selling those, I racked up a whopping 14,000 septims and bought as many consumables as I could get my hands on. When ready, I popped open the map and traveled to the Imperial City. Technically, this multicultural utopia is the last stop before the point of no return. So you've got some time to think about last minute gear and supplies before you go on inside. Feeling good and ready, I approached the Imperial City Palace and went on in.
I have watched as you blundered your way to this place. At one time, I even considered approaching you with an offer to lead my Imperial Guard. But it is plain that you are not worthy of such a position. Be not fooled by what you would call success in your journey across the Empire, for you have never faced a being as powerful as I. Your death shall be slow and torturous, a suffering that shall span the millennium. Come, I await you in the dungeons below.
Of course, the game's finale has 4 levels to it. Honestly, I was surprised the palace didn't crank things up to 5 or 6 levels. Here's the kicker with this dungeon though. The first 3 zones really aren't that difficult to get through. Sure, the enemy encounters are tough, and I died so many times at the very beginning, but the navigation and crawls were really straightforward. After battling through the onslaught of wraiths by the entrance, the rest of the enemies weren't so bad. They were mostly knights, likely Tharn's servants transformed into humans. The zone itself is really small, and there are 3 different access points to zone number 2. I traveled to the northwestern corner and went on through that doorway. Of course, this spat me out in one of 3 entranceways. I was placed in the same corner and had to travel south to the next set of stairs. The way there wasn't so straightforward, but again, the level itself is rather small. With the path I had chosen, I battled against foes like liches, homunculi, and iron golems. Singled out and separated from one another, nothing was really that difficult, but they were time and potion consuming fights. Towards the end, I started to get overwhelmed with Medusae and ranged casters. Having enough, I gave up on fighting and booked it for the doorway. At this point, I was 2 zones down and only had 2 more to go. I could smell the end credits from here. I would honestly put Degothur as the tougher dungeon, at least from my personal experience. However, level 3 is where things got rather interesting. I was placed at the center of the map. Just west of me was a doorway leading to the 4th and final zone. Maneuvering over and putting in minimal effort, I was successfully in the last level. I could hardly believe it. It just seemed too good to be true. Well, that's because it was. This entrance was meant for players who had access to Passwall. It comprised of a long narrow corridor that led to a dead end. On the other side, I could hear several liches screeching and firing off their destruction spells. Some of them were even able to hit their mark, aka me, on the opposite end of said wall. I tried to find an alternative way through, but came up short. With no other options, I returned to level 3 and had to meander my way to the next access point. It was currently south of my position, but with the pathway laid out, I had to go through half of the zone to get there. I fought through fire demons and iron golems while avoiding vampires and Medusae, mainly because I had tunnel vision for that last zone. Eventually, I made it over to the alternative entry point and went on into level 4. This might be the zone that I'm the least proud of. From where I spawned in, it essentially consisted of 4 very long walkways. Those walkways led to a lake of lava, and at its central island is my final destination. The catch is that those long hallways are filled with liches. It isn't the periodically placed evolved necromancer, it's literally every 20 or so steps, you'll see one or two of them bunched up. I thought to myself, do I really want to fight through all of these things? I honestly think my weapon would have been destroyed, I'd have run out of potions, or I would have constantly been overwhelmed. As a proud Nord warrior, I'm sure it shamed my character to tuck tail and book it past every single lich. However, as a guy just trying to finish the game, I had zero qualms with this tactic. Even so, it took me countless attempts to rush past every single enemy. I must have died upwards of 15 or so times before I finally made it to the lake of lava. However, once there, I made a leap for the central island and was able to catch my breath for a few moments. This was it, the final part of the Elder Scrolls arena. I had no clue what awaited me inside, but I was ready for anything. Going for a swim in the fiery lake, I climbed up into the chamber and was greeted by a vampire. Or at least, that's what I thought it was. After several seconds and not being able to land a single hit, I noticed the being's staff. This wasn't a vampire. This was Degothur. None of my melee attacks were landing, and it didn't seem like I was meant to defeat him like this. Looking around, the chamber contained 4 cages. The southern cages contained treasure, while the northern ones were meant for the main quest. The northwestern cell held a mithril key. This key unlocked the northeastern cell. Inside was a floating jewel, the final piece to this game's puzzle.
Truly a child of the Empire, I thank thee for thy assistance. I have a particular idea as to the question of your service in mind. From this day forth, thou art named the Eternal Champion. From thy hand shall be dealt the needs of the Empire. I, Uriel Septim, true Emperor of Tamriel, do decree and thus make law. Arise, my champion, and take thy rightful place.
As Uriel Septim VII signs off, the game displays one last message for me. It reads, "You have proven yourself a worthy champion of the Empire, and such service shall not be easily forgotten. Hang not your sword above the mantle, nor place your spellbook upon the shelves. Many such adventures still await your hand. This was but one chapter in the story of the Elder Scrolls." As the scene cuts away, I'm brought back out into the Imperial City. Even though the main questline is finished, there are still dungeons to explore and side quests to embark on. Attempting to re-enter the Imperial Palace, a guard respectfully tells me that it's under reconstruction due to the catastrophic damage. With that, thus wraps up the main story of the Elder Scrolls Arena and my adventure through the game. Before signing off, I wanted to really quickly discuss my closing thoughts. My highs, lows, the story, the gameplay, and if I would recommend this game after playing through it. For me, the highs would have to be that special hit of dopamine I got after retrieving a staff piece. In the Elder Scrolls Arena, I really felt like I had to put in the work. I had to focus, dial in, come up with strategies for certain areas, and be on top of my keyboard shortcuts. Other than maybe Morrowind, I had never felt like that while running through an Elder Scrolls dungeon. The challenge was definitely there, even with a map to show me the way through. Successfully collecting those staff fragments, even the artifacts for the factions, were feelings that I can hardly describe. having those nerves and stress while crawling through the dungeon to letting out a sigh of relief upon returning to the city. To me, those were the highs of my playthrough. As for the lows, honestly, I really wanted to quit after completing the Elden Grove. The dungeons were getting longer, more meticulous, and the rewards felt less compelling. Staff fragments 4 through 6 were such a drag, mostly because the gameplay was so repetitive. Help out a local faction, crawl through a dungeon. Discover location of staff piece, crawl through a dungeon. The first 3 pieces and the last 2 were at least a little more enjoyable, but I think that was because 1 through 3 was still novel, while with 7 and 8, the end was in sight. In any case, the repetitiveness of this game was starting to get to me. Another low, while not as low as the previous low, were the dungeon breaking glitches. Mostly when the enemies blocked my swimming path. It happened twice, once in the Elden Grove and another in the Temple of Agamanus. For some reason, likely just knowing that I could have had to go through those dungeons all over again, those were really frustrating times. I didn't show it, but I was stuck on each of those points for upwards of 10 minutes. It's a very minor thing, and it's over now, but it still makes my blood boil just thinking about it. Next, my thoughts on the story. Unfortunately, from a narration standpoint, most of this game was action. The story could probably be summarized in less than 5 minutes. Most of the plot was at the beginning and at the end. The middle part, finding the staff pieces, didn't really offer much in the way of relevant story. However, I did get to explore through some famous places in Tamriel, and I learned a little bit about them. I also got acquainted with some of the continent's more obscure factions and groups, like the Brotherhood of Seth and the Conclave of Baal. I learned about enemies like Sir Galandir, Selene, Golthog, the Priests of the Mad God, etc. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're only paying attention to Rhea Silmain and Jagar Tharn, the plot is fairly basic. However, if you take the time to think about all of the finer details, the people you meet along the way, the places you visit, and the things you encounter, this game's story is beautiful and rich. It makes sense why the citizens call Tamriel the arena. There's so much bloodshed. Each faction is vying for power, attacking one another in the main cities. The Midnight Society roams around during sundown and the people are terrified. It isn't safe to leave the confines of the city as monsters and creatures are lurking just beyond. In terms of sustenance to the Elder Scrolls series, Arena doesn't offer nearly as much as future titles. However, in terms of kicking off the series and following through with its own unique story, Arena presents itself incredibly well. As for the gameplay, the game's over 30 years old. I won't critique anything too harshly. For the time, I'm willing to bet it was leagues ahead of its competitors. The first-person gameplay, looting, weapon condition, consumables, map size, etc. Of course, by today's standards, it's clunky, stiff, barren, and poorly designed. Other than my eyesight suffering from the graphics, I actually had a better time with the game than I thought I'd have. The bones of Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim are certainly there. You can clearly see where the evolution took place. It's interesting to see too how the basic XP mechanic of fantasy games was used here, but taken out for future installments. I wouldn't say it made leveling easier or more difficult. I'm about the same level I usually am by the end of the main story. I guess though, it made leveling more simplified. You don't have to worry about which major and minor skills you're using, just about how many enemies you kill, which quests you go on, and how much you've explored. Overall, while I prefer the direction of the later Elder Scrolls games, I can respect Bethesda for starting with the norm and breaking out into something rather unique. Then lastly, would I recommend this game to others? When I did my initial thoughts video, I said everyone should play Arena to help develop a better appreciation for the later titles. After playing through the main questline, my thoughts have changed. I 100% would not recommend this game to anyone in the modern day. At least, not anyone who's looking to experience a great story in the Elder Scrolls universe. If anything, I'd probably tell the hardcore, challenge-seeking player to give it a try. Someone who enjoys difficult dungeon crawls and likes to challenge themselves. It's not even that the game is that hard, but honestly, the action is the bulk of the game. It feels like the story is there to help move the action along, instead of the opposite. So yeah, if you're a casual fan of the Elder Scrolls, I probably would not suggest Arena to you. But if you're a fan and enjoy endless combat, by all means, Arena will treat you well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the story and the game as a whole, and until next time, keep on adventuring.